I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. Another major telco outage has raised the question, what happens when you call 000 and the call doesn't get through? This week, Telstra blamed a software defect for a national outage that disrupted phones, payments and transport, and left more than 300 000 calls failing or unable to connect. The communications watchdog is now investigating. But this isn't the first time Australia's been here. Last year, Optus had its own catastrophic failure after a 13-hour outage blocked hundreds of emergency calls across South Australia, Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and was linked to deaths. ACMA opened an investigation into Optus, but still hasn't published final findings. So today, we're bringing you Ruby Jones's conversation from last year with journalist and Crikey contributor Michael Sainsbury on what went wrong at Optus and how the government's choices led us here. It's Sunday, July 12. This episode was originally published in September 2025.
So, Michael, last week, hundreds of Australians discovered that they couldn't get through when they tried to call 000 with catastrophic and we now know some fatal consequences. So tell me about what we know about what was happening with Optus's network while this was going on.
So it was just a regular network upgrade, and the telco networks, they do thousands of these a week. So there's all sorts of stuff they're doing every day. There's obviously thousands of base stations across the country. They're very sophisticated software systems that connect those things to the fibre optics underground, to the big computers that go out to your phone. So that's very, very complex networks, and there's always stuff going on. This was a regular sort of upgrade that went wrong.
Today, it was revealed the deadly outage, the result of a botched firewall upgrade that lasted 13 hours. 600 customers across 3 states without access to 000.
The outage only affected people in the Northern Territory, Western Australia and South Australia. Initially, they thought it affected about 600 calls made to emergency services.
Good evening. We have a major story developing as we go to air. Just moments ago, we learned that 3 people have died during a major Optus network outage that affected 000 calls.
Something in their processes was either bad, could have been a badly written piece of software, or it could just have been a very simple human error where things just weren't followed properly and weren't checked. If it had been a national thing, again, that may have been picked up more quickly by a system. But do those systems have enough red flags? It sounds like they don't.
Okay, and I mean, you can see how these things might happen, but you would assume that in the case of human error or, a bad update, that there would be a backup. Something would kick in if a network, isn't working like this, particularly when it comes to 000 calls. So what should have happened?
Well, there is actually a backup across all of the networks in Australia where if for some reason your networks aren't connecting to the 000 system, the calls will be routed into Telstra or Vodafone so they can access that system. Now, the 000 system is actually run by Telstra under contract to the government. So all the calls go into a call centre at Telstra, which is known as 000 or the emergency call person officially. What seems to have happened is that the customers on Optus were able to make normal calls, but they weren't able to make 000 calls, and this wasn't flagged immediately. There were also people who rang, and at least 5 people, possibly more, rang Optus call centres to tell them that the 000 wasn't working. And again, there was a failure of process there that wasn't escalated straight away.
Denied that customers tried 5 times to warn the company that emergency calls were not going through.
In the past few hours, Optus has confirmed those complaints were received by its offshore call centre.
Now, I've spoken to an engineer at one of the other networks, and he said, look, the 000, when they've got a checklist of network upgrades, 000 is absolutely at the top of the list, and it should be the first thing that's checked and double-checked before anything happens. And that didn't happen.
So in the wake of all of this, there are a lot of questions being asked about Optus and about its governance. So tell me about the company and how it is responding to this particular outage.
Most people probably know it's the second biggest telco in Australia. It's the second biggest mobile network. It's owned by Singapore Telecommunications, so it's not a publicly listed company in Australia. And the Singapore Telecoms is owned by the Singapore government. So ultimately, Singapore's responsible for everything that happens at Optus. But this is not the first time this has happened to Optus. This happened with Optus 2 years ago.
This morning we have more on that breaking news on the massive Optus outage.
10 million Optus customers are still without mobile and broadband services amid a massive nationwide outage. There is a lot developing.
There was a government inquiry.
The federal government has released the terms of reference of an investigation into this month's major Optus outage.
There were 18 recommendations handed down.
At its core is ensuring the integrity of the 000 service and that it continues to operate effectively in the interests of all Australians.
That process hasn't been finished properly. Only about 2/3 of those recommendations have been implemented, and some of the key ones had not been implemented. And then a year before that outage, they had that dreadful data breach where the data of about 9 million people was stolen.
The head of Optus says she is devastated by the cyber attack, which has potentially compromised the personal information of nearly 10 million customers.
But yeah, Optus now has got very much a reputation of being a company that is kind of making some big technical fails every couple of years. Stephen Rue is the CEO. He was brought in about 9 months ago. They got rid of the last CEO who was in charge of those last two disasters. He came from NBN, so he's pretty familiar with telecommunications networks, and he's pretty familiar with dealing with government. So it's kind of a dent in his record early on.
I want to offer a sincere apology to all customers who could not connect to emergency services when they needed them most.
But 9 months is not a hell of a lot of time in a big company like Optus to fix things. There's obviously some deep-seated cultural problems at Optus that allow these sorts of process issues to happen.
Nevertheless, we did hear the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, saying that he would be surprised if Stephen Rue, the CEO, wasn't considering his position.
I'd be surprised if that wasn't occurring.
We also heard from the Communications Minister, Annika Wells, talking about accountability and consequences.
Optus and all telecommunications providers have obligations under Australian law to make sure emergency services calls go through.
The South Australian Premier, Peter Malinauskas, called it incompetence.
I mean, the fact that Optus were crafting media statements and arranging press conferences without alerting South Australian Ambulance Service about this.
Tell me what you make of the political response.
It was pretty fast and it was pretty brutal. Look, people died, so I think political leaders feel as though they have to react. But we are, as you know, living in a world where it's very much blame first, ask questions later. And I just don't think it's terribly helpful when you've got politicians, talking about significant consequences. They want to sound tough. There's a whole lot of legislation around these sorts of things, and there are some pretty hefty fines that companies can get. And I think Optus has been fined $10 and $12 million, I think, for the last two of its problems. That being said, for big companies like these with billions of dollars of revenue every year, those sorts of fines are kind of slaps on the wrist too. So we've seen problems in banking. We've seen problems with Qantas. And there have been some pretty hefty fines, but they don't really make a big dent in these big companies. But this 000 problem keeps coming up. And when governments tend to just coast along and people say, well, this is very serious, people could die, until someone dies, nothing seems to happen. So they tend to be very reactive. And I think it's probably time that the government had a bit of a bigger look at this. So you've got inaction by the government on quite a lot of things as well as the telcos. So it's kind of a joint responsibility in a lot of ways. But ultimately, for something as critical as this, the government kind of got to be the last person standing.
Coming up, why the government is dragging its feet on recommendations that could have prevented this. Michael, I want to talk a little more about the government's role here, because while it is clear that Optus failed, what is the government's responsibility in ensuring that 000 calls can always get through?
Once upon a time, and it wasn't terribly long ago, we had one telco, which was Telecom Australia, that turned into Telstra.
Last year, Australia's Telecom invested more in Australia and Australian-made products than any other company.
It was privatised, and how government competition was introduced before that, which is how we got Optus, and we've had a reasonably competitive environment in the telecommunications sector, although, the incumbent still is the one that makes all the profits. But, these sorts of critical infrastructure services like telecommunications, energy, there was a lot of privatisation that went on without enough accountability coming back. I mean, we did have the inquiry into Optus, but the fact that 18 months after that, all of those recommendations have not been fulfilled. It's supposed to have occurred. They haven't. And this is all about a lack of urgency, I think. Most of the funding for 000 comes either directly from the government or from a government levy that's put on the telcos. So that 000 stuff is actually government responsibility. And improving that system was part of what came out of the previous Optus outage. And the government, let it linger. And so I think they do bear some responsibility here.
Yeah, tell me more about that. As you say, when this happened in the past, it triggered an inquiry, the Bean Review. So why do you think it is that has not resulted in the change that would be needed to have prevented what has just occurred?
Yeah, there were 18 recommendations about a whole bunch of stuff. The harder stuff was still not being implemented, particularly this setting up of the OO custodian inside the department. And that to me seems like a really key recommendation, that you've actually got someone that is really having a good look at the system, talking to the telcos, making sure their testing's right. Now, I think Annika Wells said, that has been set up, but it's actually not yet underway. What that actually means, I don't know, but clearly it's not working yet. And you would think that 18 months after something like that happened, for that not to be in place after 18 months, I think that's a little bit of a shame on the government.
And the Communications Minister, Annika Wells, she's fairly new to that portfolio. So what sense do you get of her, of how likely she is to look into these issues?
Well, it's certainly going to sharpen up her interest in the portfolio. Look, people inside the sector have said that she's not as engaged with the sector as the previous minister, who did have a background in telecoms. Indeed, if you look back to the previous ministers, we had Paul Fletcher for quite some time in the coalition government, before Michelle Rowland, Mitch Fifield before him, and Malcolm Turnbull. All of those people did have quite a lot of experience or background in either telcos or technology. Annika Wells doesn't have any of that experience. And telecoms is a very, very, very complex business. I mean, as we've talked about just with the mobile network, then you've got landline networks, and you've got to run internet services. There's customer call centres. There's marketing. There's Optus and Telstra have a bunch of shops. So they're vertically integrated businesses with lots of different moving parts, and it requires a very engaged minister and staff and department to make sure that the companies that are looking after telecommunications are doing their jobs properly. And this incident, and it's such a dreadful thing when, people are dead because the infrastructure fails. But this incident really should make, I think, the government have a very good look at what's happening in telecommunications. It's always been problematic because we have such a huge country with not too many people. So it's expensive compared to somewhere like Hong Kong or Singapore to provide communications infrastructure in Australia. The only thing that can stop this happening is for companies like Optus and Telstra and Vodafone and the other big telecommunications companies, TPG, to make sure they got all their processes work, to make sure they've got fail-safe and backup and all that sort of thing. And let's just look at it through what happened with the NBN. Successive governments were very frustrated that the big telecommunications companies weren't rolling out fast enough broadband quickly enough, so they took the decision in the end to use public money to build the NBN. Perhaps they need to have a look at the mobile networks as well which would take a lot of the pain away from companies, trying to service a handful of people very far away that costs a lot of money. And just to take some of that financial pressure off the networks so they can really focus on getting these things right, the things that they're supposed to be doing.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ruby.
"7 a.m. will be back tomorrow with an interview with New York Times journalist Jonathan Swan. His revealing new book, co-authored by Maggie Haberman, takes us inside Donald Trump's second term, a presidency that he says is more disciplined, more secretive, and more dangerous than the first.
When you understand it through the lens of, I want to be Napoleon, I'm being slightly glib saying that, but not really. I want to be the capital G great man of history of our time. I want to expand the American landmass, make Venezuela into a 51st state with a pliant leader who's more like a governor, take their oil, reshape Iran, take Greenland, whatever. You start to understand why he's willing to roll the dice in the way that he's rolling the dice this term, which he certainly wasn't willing to do in the first term.
I'm Daniel James. Thanks for listening.